She stood at the airport with a boarding pass in her hand, exhausted but hopeful, expecting nothing more than a routine flight. Instead, a few careless moments turned into public humiliation, her accent questioned, her intelligence dismissed, her dignity quietly stripped away. People watched. No one stepped in. What the agent didn't realize was that this woman wasn't powerless, and this moment wouldn't end at the gate. By the next morning, an entire industry would feel the shock. How did one act of ridicule trigger consequences no one saw coming? Before that day, her life moved with quiet precision. She traveled often, sometimes weekly, slipping through airports the way others slipped through routines, focused, efficient, unnoticed. To strangers, she was just another passenger juggling deadlines and fatigue. Few would have guessed that behind her calm posture was a woman who had built something extraordinary, step by step, far from the spotlight. She had grown up navigating spaces where she was constantly underestimated. Her accent, shaped by family and history, followed her everywhere, sometimes admired, often judged. Instead of shrinking, she learned to let results speak. Years of relentless work turned into a global travel enterprise, trusted by governments, corporations, and thousands of employees who depended on her vision. Yet she rarely advertised who she was. Power, she believed, didn't need to announce itself. That morning, she left home thinking only about meetings ahead. The airport was crowded, loud, and different. Rolling suitcases echoed across polished floors as announcements blurred into background noise. It felt routine, safe, forgettable. She stood in line like everyone else, unaware that this ordinary moment was quietly loading tension she couldn't yet see. Because for people like her, normalcy was fragile. It took only one assumption, one look, one careless judgment to turn invisibility into a target. Airports were supposed to be neutral spaces, gateways, not battlegrounds. But history had taught her that prejudice rarely waits for permission. As she stepped closer to the counter, nothing seemed unusual. No warning signs, no raised voices, just another checkpoint on another long day. What she didn't know was that within minutes, her entire sense of safety would be shaken, and a single interaction would expose how quickly respect can vanish when bias steps in. The shift was subtle at first, almost easy to miss. The line moved forward, passengers stepping up, documents exchanged, faces barely acknowledged. When it was her turn, the air around the counter felt colder. The agent's posture stiffened, eyes lingering longer than necessary, scanning her face, her name, her passport. Time slowed. The hum of the terminal faded into something distant and hollow. Her accent surfaced naturally as she confirmed basic travel details, the same way it always did. That was the moment everything changed. The agent's expression tightened, a look that carried impatience, then disbelief, then something sharper. Movements became exaggerated. Instructions were repeated slowly, deliberately, as if simplicity alone could bridge a gap that didn't exist. Each gesture landed heavier than the last. People nearby noticed. A few glanced over, curiosity flickering before quickly turning away. No one intervened. No one questioned why a routine check was stretching on while others breezed through. The power imbalance was unmistakable, pressing down on her chest. She felt it in the way her space shrank, in how the counter suddenly felt like a barrier instead of a service point. She remained composed, but inside, old memories stirred. Classrooms where her intelligence had been doubted, boardrooms where her voice had been ignored until numbers spoke for her. She had learned long ago that reacting emotionally often fed the very stereotypes used against her. Still, restraint came at a cost. Each dismissive glance chipped away at her sense of dignity. The agent flagged her documents for additional review. Bags were set aside. Time dragged. The quiet scrutiny felt performative, as though the delay itself was the punishment. She could feel eyes on her now, measuring, judging, silently deciding who she was based on fragments of sound and skin tone. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was surgical. What stung most was the ease of it all. How quickly professionalism dissolved into bias. How confidently authority was wielded without accountability. The airport, with its cameras and protocols, was supposed to be controlled, fair. Yet here she was, reduced to a stereotype in one of the most public spaces imaginable. As minutes turned into longer stretches, the consequences began to ripple outward. Her schedule tightened. meetings grew uncertain. An entire network of plans, contracts, and commitments balanced precariously on this single delay. The agent had no idea what was being disrupted, no awareness of how many livelihoods depended on her catching that flight. Finally, clearance came without explanation. No acknowledgement of the delay. No correction. Just an unspoken expectation that she would quietly move on. She gathered her belongings, hand steady, expression unreadable. To anyone watching, it might have looked like resolution. But beneath the surface, something irreversible had shifted. This wasn't an isolated inconvenience. It was a reminder of how fragile respect could be when filtered through prejudice. As she walked toward the gate, surrounded by strangers who would never know what had just happened, a decision was forming, slow, deliberate, and powerful. What the agent believed was a finished moment was only the beginning, and the consequences, already set in motion, were moving far beyond the airport walls. The moment didn't explode, it crystallized. Sitting alone near the gate, she replayed everything in her mind with painful clarity, the slowed instructions, the looks that lingered too long, the silent message that she didn't belong. Around her, travelers rushed past, unaware that something profound had just cracked open. Her flight status blinked on the screen, but her focus had shifted somewhere deeper. This was no longer about embarrassment. It was about power being misused so casually that it felt invisible to everyone except the person carrying its weight. She felt the familiar pressure to minimize it, to excuse it, to move on the way she had been taught to for years. But this time, the cost of silence felt heavier than the risk of action. As the plane lifted into the air, her phone lit up with missed calls and messages. Partners waiting, teams spread across continents, decisions pending, entire operations aligned around her movement. The delay had already triggered consequences she could no longer contain. What had happened at that counter wasn't isolated. It had reached into boardrooms, contracts, and timelines far beyond that terminal. In the quiet of the cabin, resolve replaced shock. She documented everything while the details were still sharp, each memory anchored by the calm clarity of someone who understood systems, how they protected some and failed others. This wasn't anger acting blindly. It was strategy forming under pressure. By the time the plane landed, the story had outgrown the airport. Executives were asking questions. Legal teams were reviewing protocols. Long-standing partnerships were being re-evaluated with a single, uncomfortable realization at the center. Respect had been violated, and accountability could no longer be avoided. What the agent had treated as a fleeting interaction was now a fault line. A routine act of bias had collided with unseen influence, and the ground was beginning to shift. The real impact hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming fast. And when it did, the world would have to decide whether this was just another forgotten moment of injustice, or the instant everything finally changed. The outcome didn't arrive with applause or headlines, at least not at first. It came quietly, through canceled agreements, frozen partnerships, and a sudden absence that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. Within days, the airport authority felt it. Routes were reevaluated, contracts dissolved. A travel network worth billions redirected its business elsewhere, leaving behind questions no one could ignore. What had been dismissed as a minor interaction was now impossible to minimize. For her, there was no celebration. The victory, if it could be called that, was heavy. She returned to her work with the same discipline she always had, but something had changed. The incident stayed with her, not as a wound, but as a reminder of how fragile dignity can be in spaces built on power and assumption. She hadn't sought revenge. She had demanded respect in the only language the system seemed to understand. The agent never knew her full story when it mattered. And that was the point. Respect should never depend on wealth, titles, or influence. No one should have to prove their worth to be treated as human. Yet for millions, that burden still exists, carried into workplaces, classrooms, hospitals, and airports every single day. This wasn't just about one woman or one airport. It was about how easily bias slips into routine, how often silence protects it, and how rarely accountability follows, unless someone has the means to force it. Her story exposed an uncomfortable truth. Injustice doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It only grows quieter and more dangerous. Change doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like absence, like lost trust, like doors closing where they once stayed open. And sometimes It starts with one person deciding that being humiliated is not the price of existing. So the question remains, for those without billion-dollar leverage, without power or protection, how many moments like this go unanswered every day? And what kind of world are we building if respect is still something that has to be earned?